In 1951, if you wanted to buy the fastest standard production saloon car available from a British manufacturer, one of the strongest candidates was a Vauxhall, not a Jaguar, not a Riley, not a Rover. A Vauxhall, the mark that the British motoring establishment had already decided was the General Motors subsidiary, the Luton factory car. The sensible fleet saloon for people who were buying with their heads and not their hearts. The car was the Vauxhall Velox, and the claim attached to it that it was fast, that it represented genuine performance, at a price that the executive buyer could reach, was not invented by a marketing department. It was grounded in specific figures that period road tests confirmed. The Velox's 2262cc six-cylinder engine, in a car that weighed comfortably under 1.5 tons, produced performance that placed it among the quickest large saloons available in Britain in the early 1950s. The name itself, Velox, from the Latin for swift, was a statement of intent, not an aspiration. And yet the Velox failed. Not commercially, it sold in respectable numbers throughout its production life, from 1951 to 1957. It failed in the more durable sense. It failed to establish itself in the imagination of the British car-buying public in the way that its specification warranted, failed to build the reputation that its performance figures should have generated, and was replaced in 1957 by a car, the PA Velox, whose American styling triggered a reaction so divisive that it buried whatever goodwill the earlier model had accumulated. The reason the Velox failed in this more important sense is not, when you examine it closely, a story about the car itself. It is a story about the company behind it, and about a specific decision that General Motors made regarding its British operation that constrained everything Vauxhall did in the 1950s more thoroughly than any engineering choice ever could. That decision and its consequences is where this story actually begins. Vauxhall, General Motors, and the E-Series body. Vauxhall had been a General Motors subsidiary since 1925, when GM acquired the Luton manufacturer as its British bridgehead into the European car market. The relationship had produced, before the Second World War, a range of competent, if unremarkable, cars that competed effectively in the volume end of the British market without threatening the prestige positions held by the established British makes. By 1945, the relationship between Luton and Detroit was well understood on both sides. Vauxhall designed its own cars, but it designed them within parameters that General Motors set, using investment that General Motors provided and on a development schedule that General Motors approved. The E-Series body that the Velox wore from 1951 was a monocoque design genuinely modern in its construction principles, offering structural advantages over the separate body and chassis cars that several British competitors still produced at the time. The styling was conservative by the standards of what American manufacturers were selling in the same period, but it was clean and proportioned in a way that dated less rapidly than the more fashion-conscious British cars of the early 1950s. From the outside, the Velox looked like exactly what it was, a solidly designed, well-finished medium-large British saloon with no particular visual excitement and no particular visual failings. What the E-Series body shared with the smaller Wyvern, which used a 4-cylinder engine in the same body shell, was both its principal commercial virtue and, in a market increasingly attentive to differentiation, its most significant liability. The Velox buyer, paying considerably more than the Wyvern buyer, received a car that was visually identical to a lesser model. The 6-cylinder engine sat under a bonnet of exactly the same shape as the 4 cylinders. The trim differences that distinguished the Velox from the Wyvern were real, but not dramatic. This was badge engineering in its most transparent form, and the British market of the 1950s, where the appearance of a car communicated social information with a precision that its occupants took seriously, was not entirely forgiving of it. The decision to build the Velox and Wyvern on the same body was General Motors' decision, not Vauxhall's. The economies of scale that a shared platform produced were real and significant. The cost to the Velox's identity in a market where identity mattered considerably was also real, and the people at Luton who understood the British executive car buyer knew it. The problem was, that they were not the people making the decision. This tension between what Luton's engineers understood about their market and what Detroit's accountants required of their subsidiary runs through the entire Velox story, and it is the thread that the introduction promised to find at the beginning. Here it is. The six-cylinder case. What the Velox actually delivered. Strip away the badge engineering problem for a moment and examine what the Velox actually offered its buyer in 1951, and the case for it is considerably stronger than its reputation suggests. The 2262cc overhead valve six-cylinder engine was a development of the unit that Vauxhall had been refining since the late 1940s, and it produced in the E-Series Velox approximately 54 to 57 brake horsepower, depending on the specification and the period source consulted. That output, in a car weighing in the region of 1,100 kilograms, produced performance that contemporary road tests recorded as a 0 to 60 miles per hour time of approximately 23 to 24 seconds and a top speed in the region of 80 miles per hour. Those figures require context. In 1951, 80 miles per hour was a meaningful number on British roads, and 23 seconds to 60 was competitive with the majority of what the British market offered at the Velox's price. The ride quality that the monocoque construction and the Velox's suspension geometry produced was, by the consistent account of period road tests, genuinely good, smooth enough on the improving road surfaces of early 1950s Britain to make the car feel more refined than its price strictly required. The Autocar, testing the E-Series Velox in the early 1950s, noted that the ride approached the standard of considerably more expensive cars, and that the engine's smoothness was a particular virtue, a six-cylinder at relaxed speeds, producing less vibration and less noise than the four-cylinder alternatives in the same price bracket. The gearbox told a different story. The three-speed column change unit positioned on the steering column in the American fashion that Vauxhall had adopted from its parent company attracted near-universal criticism from British road testers who preferred floor-mounted levers and found the column change imprecise in a way that the engine's performance character did not justify. A car that could reach 80 miles per hour deserved, in the opinion of most who drove it, a gearbox whose operation at speed did not require the degree of advanced planning that the column change imposed. The gearbox was not broken. It was simply wrong for the market it was in. The interior of the Velox was well finished in a way that reflected the Vauxhall tradition of practical quality, rather than the specific opulence that the premium British makes was selling. The seating was comfortable across long distances. The instrumentation was clear and complete. The heating, which was not a trivial consideration in a British car of the early 1950s, was effective. These were the qualities that the buyer who actually drove a Velox discovered, and that the buyer who had not driven one did not discuss, because they did not fit the narrative that the marque's position in the British hierarchy had established. The fuel economy that the Velox returned in normal use was another virtue that the car's press coverage underweighted. Period figures placed the Velox at somewhere between 24 and 28 miles per imperial gallon in mixed-use figures that, for a six-cylinder car of this performance level in the early 1950s, compared favorably with the competition. For the buyer who covered significant mileage in the course of professional life, the running cost calculation that the Velox produced was a meaningful part of its appeal. The car offered more performance per pound of purchase price and more economy per mile than most of what it competed with. These were not qualities that the British executive car buyer's social calculus rewarded, but they were qualities that his accountant, if he had one, would have noticed. The reputation problem, and why it was not entirely the car's fault. The Vauxhall Velox's failure to establish itself as a genuinely desirable executive car in the British market is a case study in how a product's identity is determined as much by what surrounds it as by what it is. The Velox was not a prestige car. It was positioned, priced, and marketed as a practical, capable, fast-for-the-money saloon in a market where the buyers who wanted practical and capable already had the Wyvern, and the buyers who wanted prestige had the Rover, the Wolseley, and the Riley at roughly the same price. The Velox was in between, and between was nowhere to be. The General Motors parentage did not help. British car buyers in the 1950s were acutely aware of the social signals that manufacturer identity carried, and the General Motors signal was not the same as the Rover signal or the Wolseley signal. It was the signal of rational procurement, of fleet buying, of choosing the car that made financial sense rather than the car that made social sense. That signal was not inaccurate. Vauxhalls were, by any reasonable measure, well-engineered and well-priced cars. But it made the Velox invisible to the buyer, for whom the executive car purchase was primarily a statement, and that buyer was a very significant part of the market the Velox was attempting to reach. The professional classes who bought Rovers and Wolseleys in the early 1950s were not, in the main, buying on performance criteria. They were buying on identity criteria. A Rover P4 was slower than the Velox. It was considerably more expensive than the Velox. It returned worse fuel economy than the Velox. But the Rover P4 buyer was making a statement that the Velox could not make a statement about what kind of professional they were, what kind of organization they belonged to, what kind of country they lived in and valued. The Velox's performance figures were irrelevant to that decision. This is the structural failure that no amount of engineering improvement could have addressed. Vauxhall's position in the British hierarchy was fixed, not by what its cars did, but by who was perceived to drive them. Fleet managers, commercial travelers, people who chose their cars from the company car list rather than from personal preference. That positioning was not entirely fair to the cars, and it was not entirely accurate to the buyers. But it was thoroughly established, and the Velox was never able to build enough of a reputation on its own performance merits to escape it. What makes this particularly pointed in the Velox's case is that Vauxhall's engineers were aware of the problem and did not have the tools to solve it. The decisions that had created the identity constraint, the General Motors acquisition in 1925, the platform sharing policy, the column gear change adopted from American practice, were not decisions that the people at Luton had made. They had inherited the consequences, and the Velox was the car that bore the most visible cost of those consequences. A car called Velox, with an engine that justified the name, carrying the disadvantage of an identity it had not chosen and could not escape. The PA, the aftermath, and what the Velox means today. The PA Velox that replaced the E-Series in 1957 was a dramatically different-looking car, wider, lower, heavily influenced by the American styling language that General Motors was applying across its range in the mid-1950s, and equipped with tail fins that were modest by Detroit standards and conspicuous by any standard that British automotive taste in 1957 was prepared to accept. The reaction from the British press was mixed to hostile. The reaction from the British public, as registered through sales, was considerably more positive. The PA sold well, particularly after the Cresta variant introduced a more lavishly trimmed version of the same platform that addressed some of the identity gap the E-Series had struggled with. The E-Series Velox that the PA replaced was, in retrospect, the more coherent car. Its proportions were resolved, where the PA's were imitative. Its relationship between performance and appearance was honest where the PA's was aspirational. And the six-cylinder engine that both cars shared, refined between 1951 and 1957 into a unit that later Velox owners found thoroughly dependable, gave the E-Series a mechanical case that has aged better than the styling controversy that surrounded the car that succeeded it. In the classic car market today, the E-Series Vauxhall Velox occupies the particular territory of the overlooked post-war British saloon, a territory that has been developing collector interest as the more celebrated marques of the same period reach price points that exclude buyers who want to use and maintain a classic rather than preserve and exhibit one. The Velox's mechanical simplicity, the robustness of the six-cylinder unit, and the availability of parts through the Vauxhall PA, Velox, Cresta and Victor Owners Club make it a more practical ownership proposition than its current values might suggest is necessary. Surviving E-Series Veloxes are uncommon. The car was bought and used as working transport, and attrition over 7 decades has been severe. A genuinely sound example with documented history and an honest mechanical condition represents the kind of acquisition that the current classic market occasionally rewards, disproportionately as awareness of neglected models grows. The corrosion that accumulates in the sills and floor of any E-Series car that has not been carefully maintained is the primary structural concern on any purchase. And the column gear change that British road testers disliked in 1951 is one of the first things a prospective buyer should assess on a test drive, not because it is unworkable, but because its condition tells you a great deal about how the car has been used and by whom. The Vauxhall Velox was, in the plainest possible summary, a better car than it was allowed to be. Its engineering was sound, and its performance was genuine. Its construction was more modern than several of the cars it competed against. Its ride quality was acknowledged even by critics who found other things to object to. It cost less than the cars it was benchmarked against, and delivered more of the measurable performance criteria than most of them. None of that was enough, because the British executive car market of the 1950s was not primarily a performance market or an engineering market. It was an identity market, and the Vauxhall identity shaped by General Motors ownership, by the shared platform with the cheaper Wyvern, by the fleet procurement associations that had accumulated across a generation of commercial use, was not an identity that allowed a fast car to be received as fast in the way that the same performance in a Rover or a Riley would have been received. The lesson is one that the automotive industry has learned and relearned across every decade since. The question a car buyer asks is not primarily, what does this car do? But what does this car say? The Velox's answer to the second question undermined everything its answer to the first question had earned. That is a failure of positioning and heritage and corporate strategy. It is not a failure of the car. There are Veloxes out there, properly maintained E-Series cars with their 6 cylinders running cleanly, and their column changes operating with the precision the mechanism requires when it is cared for, that are, on a good road, exactly what the name says. Swift. They were swift in 1951, when nobody gave them credit for it. And they are swift now, when almost nobody remembers they ever were. Now, I want to hear from you. Did a Vauxhall Velox feature in your family, in your working life, or in your experience of the British roads of the 1950s and 60s? Do you own one now? And has the driving of it confirmed or confounded what the reputation would lead you to expect? The overlooked cars in this series attract the most interesting comments, because the people who know them tend to know them well and to have formed views that the mainstream account does not reflect. Leave it in the comments. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription are appreciated. Thank you for watching.